in between 3 and protected. All right. For the last time, we're going to make a call to the audience. I see students from Nimilango College standing. All right.
Like, get in the frame, I think. Man, it's for the cameras. Okay, economic sanctions undermine effective dialogue. So I think particularly for this particular resolution, we may have to go back to precisely how wars begin or for the start of the wars. I think most probably the beginning of a war is characterized by a sort of superior complex between two sides. We think that we imagine a situation where one side feels bigger, or Russia feels bigger than Ukraine, China bigger than Taiwan, and the Hutus bigger than the Tutsi. That particularly means that in any war, there's a superior complex. There's someone who feels like they're the bigger person, and their goal is most probably to prove that at the end of the war, or inevitably. But then also, we think that both of these people cannot come to terms to any particular situation. We also acknowledge, however, that in the course of a war, there's most probably a lot of things being lost. This just goes to show you the sort of urgency of the matter. We then, however, believe that in a war, a lot of lives are being lost, but then also the economic structures of particular countries are being damaged. What we then go ahead to believe is in a particular situation, when a particular party feels bigger than the other, we then strive to then make people come to a round table and feel the same. A problem comes when you make people feel like a way for them to come down is by infringing more laws on these particular sides. An idea is when sanctions were infringed, when sanctions were put on Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war by NATO, the idealistic goal was to make Russia come down. Ideally, that ought to have happened, but that did not happen. Particularly why? Because Russia felt superior, and Russia's goal was to prove that even with NATO's influence, even with the sanctions, it can still be the bigger party at the end of the day. That just means that when you have two particular people at a war, the worst possible solution is to make someone or give someone the drive or the incentive to prove their essentiality. That creates what we would then term as retaliation. So we think that sanctions then invoke retaliation in people, and then that just goes to show, to make them prove a sort of superiority complex on the other hand. Now the problem with that is it accelerates the war. If the goal is to end the war and you are accelerating the war, then the idea is that you are not achieving what you're supposed to be achieving. If the idea is to end the war, then the team that wins the debate is the one that ends the war in the most time sufficient bracket, but then one that also does not accelerate the war. Then panel, we also then understand, we imagine a particular situation where the sanctions do not work. In a situation where sanctions only just accelerate the period of the war or accelerate the loss that we are having. When that particularly happens, then the end goal or the last possible solution is the most reasonable in the first place. And that is diplomacy. That is effective dialogue. Effective dialogue comprises of when two people or two parties sit down and realize that most probably there is a problem at hand. But then also, we think that effective dialogue can only be so if the two sides do not feel like one of them has been pushed to the wall. Essentially, when you have two groups of people, or when you have the Hutu and the Tutsi sitting in the same room in Arusha and then coming to an agreement, when you do not impugn sanctions on one particular person or make them push to a table and make them feel like they ought to prove their superiority at the end of the day, you then have effective dialogue. Essentially what we mean is even when the sanctions do not work, or even when team negator sanctions do not work, at the end of the day, we then ought to have diplomacy. The particular problem is when you opt for sanctions in the first place, you cannot have diplomacy at the end of the day. Or even the effective dialogue then takes a longer time. So on the idea of urgency, we think that sanctions just prolong the war. But even at best, it will reach a particular time within the war where we ought to come up with a solution and we aim for diplomacy. We think diplomacy then also takes a longer. But then also, a sort of second idea that we want to drive on Vladimir Putin, but the sanctions are being placed on the Republic of Russia. The sanctions are being placed on the people of Uganda. The particular problem with that is that the people then suffer. We have economic paralysis within the country of Uganda when sanctions are being placed on them. So ideally, the problem would be then to then make people suffer through an idea of a lot of war and prolong war, accelerate war, and yet at the end of the day, diplomacy could have proved a much better solution. If you're going to make the people of Uganda suffer through a war and economic paralysis, then it would just not make any sense. Ideally, we think diplomacy is the best, or ideally effective dialogue then just caters for urgency in the first hand. We also think effective dialogue can only be effective if we do not have the sanctions, if we do not push particular parties into corners and make few people like they can come up with a certain decision as one group, or we make people feel like the table is leveled and the grounds are leveled for discussion and compromise in particular warfare decisions. We think that particularly what Team Affirmative fronts for is ending particular wars in Russo-Ukraine affiliated areas in Uganda in the shortest period.
Excuse me. Guys, let's behave, okay? If you have not been able to make it here, then give the guys here up latitude, okay? And I'm speaking, some of you are still speaking. Guys, we are mature. This is secondary, not primary. We are not your teachers here to police you with canes, okay? So respect yourselves. Thank you.
Economic sanctions undermine effective dialogue. Now, before we start today's discussion, we first have to understand exactly how economic sanctions work and what they look like. Now, we have to understand firstly that these economic sanctions are placed on countries. These economic sanctions are placed on countries that go ahead and undermine the norms of international law, for example, by violating human rights. Equipment, they have reduced raw materials for production, reduced industry, and yet we know that economy is actually the heart of the strength of any country. Now they come ahead and talk about how economic sanctions will go ahead and cause people to suffer. Yes, that is true, but it is only for a little while, because we know that when people see that their country is experiencing economic sanctions, that's when the social contract theory comes in. They will go ahead and apply public pressure onto their country. They will go ahead and labor strike. They will go ahead and riot. What happens in this case? The country is receiving internal and external pressure from outside, from its people, and also from its allies outside to actually compromise its decisions that it's made in warfare. That is why you see countries like North Korea go ahead to actually reduce the manufacture of nuclear weapons, actually reduce, let us say, at least compromise in terms of how they actually test them and all that stuff. They come and give us like a scenario of Russia and Ukraine. We understand, we understand that yes, the war did not end when Russia experienced those economic sanctions. But what happened via house? What Team Affirmative does not come and put to the table, what Team Affirmative does not come and put to the table is that we do realize that the war was cooled down to a certain area. That is Kiev. It does not now occur in the entire country of Ukraine, and we see that at least half a lot is
actually coming for a particular community and use freedom. However, what we see with diplomacy that they advocate for, diplomacy is slow. It is as slow as eating food using unexcused food. We see that as you are making meetings, as you are organizing meetings, the next one postpones, the next one says that, and again, people actually experiencing pain and devastation. However, when you go ahead and force an economic sanction, people, like I said, an economic sanction will provide internal and external pressure. As soon as possible, it doesn't undermine agency, whether the promote agency. We see that these countries are going to come, the ones that have received economic sanctions, and actually come and ask for the effective dialogue themselves. We see that economic sanctions do not undermine effective dialogue. What do? They rather embrace the effective dialogue. They promote effective dialogue. Because now if you are advocating for diplomacy, how many years has diplomacy worked? For how many years has the Russian Ukraine war? For how many years has the Israeli-Palestine war? But if we actually continue addressing economic sanctions which are working, thank you. Allow me just to a simple class. When you go to the jungle and push a bear, you most likely wanting to tell the bear of what it is terrible. That is to say, that if you're most likely sanctioning the pressure, you're most likely informing of what it is capable. If you're putting certain things at stake, it means that you're putting the lives of individuals in that kind of particular country at stake. All still does not understand what that kind of burden means in today's world. Second, we think that they go ahead and discuss that North Korea most likely reduced its guns because of the sanctions. I need to understand that even when they like today's debate, North Korea didn't most likely reduce the guns because of sanctions. It reduced them because of that diplomacy with Donald Trump. That is then most likely going to say that it was an effective dialogue. We say that there was a moment, an effective dialogue then deserves to become a way to share ideas and build understanding, trust and collaboration. But let me also discuss that effective dialogue must less likely before it is slow. But even when we think it is slow, we think it can reduce the accelerated war. That is to say that we better go for an effective dialogue and have a peaceful than go to sanction countries like Russia, where we think that they are most likely going to go and do politics. The problem is that countries like Russia